The sun hung like a lead weight in the sky, pressing down on the plains until the air shimmered. Rick pulled hard on the leather reins. Blaze let out a sharp, rhythmic huff, hooves churning the dry earth as the wagon train shuddered to a final grinding halt. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the creak of cooling iron and the distant, dry rattle of wind through scrub brush. Rusty trotted to the front of the lead wagon, his tail stiff, ears swiveling toward the horizon. He let out a low, vibrating growl. Rick climbed down from the seat, his boots sinking into the dust. He walked to the back of the wagon and kicked the wood of a supply crate. It echoed with a hollow, mocking thud. Empty. He turned to face the others, his jaw set, his eyes scanning the faces. The heat was a physical barrier. Rick wiped the grit from his forehead, his hand lingering on the grip of his sidearm. "Listen up," Rick said, his voice gravelly and low. "The trail does not care if you are hungry. Let us talk about how we survive out here." Rick reached into the back of the wagon and hauled out a heavy canvas sack. The fabric was stained with grease and grit. He dropped it onto the tailgate with a dull, heavy thud that puffed a cloud of white dust into the stagnant air. He untied the rope at the top, his fingers moving with practiced, calloused precision. He reached inside and pulled out a jagged, off-white square. It looked more like a piece of limestone than sustenance. He held it up, turning it so the harsh sunlight caught the edges. "This is the reality," Rick said, his voice cutting through the dry wind. "Hardtack and salt pork. That is all we have left." He snapped the piece in half. It broke with a sharp, brittle crack that sounded like a dry bone snapping. He tossed one piece to a man nearby and bit into the other himself. His jaw muscles tightened, his face grimacing as he ground the rock-hard substance between his teeth. It was a slow, deliberate, and painful process. "We eat this until our teeth ache," he continued. "It is just fuel to keep us moving when the body wants to quit." He wiped the white dust from his palms. Rick set the empty sack aside and reached for a battered tin pot resting near the small, dying fire. The metal was scorched black from countless nights over open flames. He tilted the pot, and a dark, viscous liquid poured into a dented tin cup. It did not splash. It flowed like slow-moving sludge. Steam rose in a thin, lazy spiral, carrying the sharp, burnt scent of overboiled grounds. Rick held the cup out, the dark surface reflecting the harsh, unforgiving glare of the midday sun. "This is the only luxury we have," he said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly rasp. "And it is a total necessity." He took a slow, deliberate sip, his eyes narrowing as the bitter heat hit his throat. He did not flinch. He handed the cup to a man nearby, his movements steady. "We boil it until it is thick as mud. It is not meant to taste good. It is meant to keep your eyes open when the darkness tries to pull you under." He gestured toward the vast, empty plains that stretched out in every direction. "When you are on the night watch, and the silence starts to play tricks on your mind, this is the only thing that keeps you from nodding off. It is the difference between staying alert and losing the trail in the dark." He watched the man take a sip and grimace, then nodded, satisfied that the point had been made. Rick set the tin cup down on the wagon board and turned his attention to the rifle sleeve mounted against the side of the wagon. His hand moved to the leather, his fingers tracing the worn stitching before he gripped the stock of his lever-action rifle. He pulled it free with a sharp, metallic slide. The sunlight glinted off the barrel, highlighting the absence of any recent use. He held the weapon up, gesturing with it toward the horizon where the plains stretched out in a flat, unending line. "You cannot rely on the land to feed you," Rick said, his voice hard and steady. "You look out there and see grass, but the buffalo do not care about our hunger." He lowered the rifle and tapped the empty chamber. "I have spent 3 days tracking a herd, moving through the brush until my boots were worn thin and my canteen was dry. I found nothing but dust and heat." He leaned against the wagon, the wood groaning under his weight. "You hunt for 3 days, you burn your energy, and you come back with nothing." He looked at the men gathered around him, his expression unyielding. "You learn to value every single scrap of dried meat you have left. Rick leaned the rifle back into its sleeve and walked toward the edge of the camp, where the land dipped into a shallow, muddy depression. A thin, sluggish stream cut through the dirt, its surface coated in a layer of stagnant green scum. He stopped at the bank and pointed a calloused finger at the water. "Look at that," he said, his voice dropping to a low, warning growl. "It looks like relief. It looks like a way to stop the thirst." He knelt and scooped a handful of the murky liquid, letting it drip slowly back into the pool. "But you do not drink from the first place you see. You see that color? That is the mark of a fever that will put you in the ground faster than any bullet from an ambush." He stood up, wiping his hand on his thigh, his eyes scanning the men to ensure they understood the gravity of the mistake. "If you drink that, you will be shaking with chills before the sun sets. You will be unable to hold the reins, unable to walk. We boil it, every drop. We build a fire. We wait for the steam, and we kill the sickness before it kills us." Rick turned his back on the stream and reached into a small, reinforced pouch tied to the side of the wagon. He pulled out a piece of fruit that had long since lost its shape and color. It was a shriveled, dark lump, hard as stone and barely recognizable. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger, rotating it so the men could see the deep wrinkles in the skin. "This is what happens when you spend months on the trail without a garden," Rick said, his voice dry. "Scurvy is the silent killer. It does not strike with a roar or a flash of steel. It rots you from the inside out until your gums bleed and your joints lock up. You stop being a man and start being a burden." He squeezed the dried apple, but it did not give. "We have nothing fresh. No greens, no life. Just this." He tossed the piece of fruit back into the pouch and leaned against the wagon wheel. "At the trading posts, when we finally reach them, we do not look for gold or whiskey. We look for a single onion. We will trade our last coins just to get one piece of fresh produce to keep the rot at bay." He looked at the men, his eyes hard. "You think you are tough enough to survive the distance? You are not. Not if you ignore the small things. Health is a currency out here, and we are running dangerously low on change." Rick let the silence settle, his eyes lingering on the men to see if the weight of his words had taken hold. He turned to secure the pouch, his movements slow and deliberate, when the air changed. It was not a sound, but a sudden stillness. Rusty, who had been lying in the dust near the wagon wheels, bolted upright. The dog did not growl. He simply froze, his head angled sharply toward a dense patch of scrub brush 50 yards to the east. His ears were locked forward, twitching. Rick stopped mid-motion, his hand hovering near the wagon frame. He watched the dog, reading the tension in the animal's stiffened spine. Rusty let out a single sharp bark that cut through the heat like a blade. It was not a warning. It was a signal of intent. Rick felt the shift in the environment instantly. He scanned the horizon, his jaw tightening as he searched the tall grass. The wind died down, and the only thing left was the sound of the dog's heavy breathing. Rick knew the difference. He simply moved. Rick did not hesitate. His hand moved to the leather sleeve mounted on the side of the wagon. He gripped the stock of the lever-action rifle, pulling it free in one fluid, practiced motion. The metal clicked as he checked the chamber, his eyes never leaving the swaying brush. He did not look at the men. He did not offer another word of advice. The lecture was over. He stepped toward the horse, Blaze, who was already shifting his weight and blowing air through flared nostrils. Rick grabbed the saddle horn and swung his leg over, settling into the seat with a heavy thud. He reached down to check the 6-gun at his hip, ensuring the holster was clear. The transition was absolute. The man who had been teaching about scurvy and salt pork was gone, replaced by a scout ready for a fight. He clicked his tongue, and the horse stepped forward, muscles bunching under the skin. Rick leaned low over the neck of the horse, his gaze piercing the green wall of the brush. Every muscle in his body was coiled, ready to respond to whatever emerged from the scrub. The brush remained still. No movement followed the initial disturbance. Rick held his position for a long count, his eyes scanning the shadows until the tension in his shoulders finally began to ebb. Whatever had been watching them had retreated into the deep grass. He let out a slow, steady breath, his grip on the rifle loosening just enough to signal the end of the immediate alert. He turned his head and signaled to the team. There was no need for words. The wagon wheels groaned, a deep, metallic protest against the dry earth as they began to turn. Blaze stepped forward, hooves thudding into the packed dirt. Rick guided the horse back toward the trail, his eyes fixed on the horizon that stretched out like an endless, shimmering sea of dust. The wagon train picked up pace, the sound of the creaking wood and rattling supplies, becoming a rhythmic, lonely pulse in the silence of the plains. He did not look back. The path ahead was long, and the sun continued to beat down with relentless intensity. Each revolution of the wheels took them further into the isolation of the landscape. The vastness swallowed the sound of their progress, leaving only the heat and the horizon. Rick rode on, a small, singular figure against the backdrop of an unforgiving, infinite space. The trail was calling, and they answered, disappearing slowly into the haze of the distance, where the earth met the sky in a blur of gold and brown. The struggle was not over. It was simply the only life they knew.